tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Again, priorities are entirely out of whack. You have government saying that the big things they need to do are giving millions of dollars to pasta companies. And then you have people in Canadian cities looking around and wondering how things got so bad. We've talked about homelessness and drugs on the show, which have ballooned into these massive problems in pretty much every community in Canada. One we haven't given as much attention to has been auto thefts. Now, I'm very fortunate in that my car has been broken into, not for several years, but it has never been stolen. There are people in cities like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal who have had their cars stolen multiple times. This has become such an incredible way of life where I believe in Toronto, cars are stolen every 14 minutes. There's a car is stolen every 14 minutes in Toronto. I think that's the stat. It's certainly in and around there. So the Ontario government has decided to get tough on this. One of the things they're going to do, if you do it more than 3 times, they're going to revoke your driver's license. Yeah, that'll show you. You can't drive because now when you steal the car, well, you won't be able to because you don't have a driver's license. Look, I'm all for tough on crime stuff. This kind of strikes me as one of these things where it sounds good on paper, but it's like a lot of gun control things, a policy predicated on criminals following the law, which by definition they are not doing. But let's bring in someone much smarter in the ways of the criminal law and the justice system than I, Ari Goldkind, host with SiriusXM and criminal lawyer extraordinaire. Ari, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Great to be with you. And before we get to this, I was just listening to the last few minutes of you talking about $200 and something per person per day. You're one of the few people in Canada who has the guts to talk about it. It should be at the top headline from the Globe and Mail, which used to talk about and write about things like this. And God forbid the Toronto Star never will. So for whoever's listening, I really applaud you for talking about it because it is the third rail. And hopefully the more people who start to talk about it, now with Elon Musk's permission, of course, I think is the only way to make a difference. So I don't mean to divert from what we're going to talk about, but what you've just talked about is really important. And it drives me absolutely bat, fill in the blank, because those are my absolutely wasted tax dollars. And I can assure you, Andrew, you and your listeners can figure out how much I pay a year in tax.
Well, no, I appreciate that, Ari, and it affects everyone. And like a lot of policies, it is a consequence of bad policy elsewhere. Because, people say, okay, well, we have these asylum claimants here. What are we supposed to do about them? Well, yeah, let's go back to the first principle there. Why are they here? Because the government has not protected the border and has basically allowed this ridiculous loophole in the asylum process to unfold. So anyway, now you're getting me to do a secondary rant on that, but I appreciate the kind words, Ari. You always tackle things in a very fearless way as well. The auto theft thing in Toronto, in Vancouver, and Montreal, it's actually quite ridiculous. And I don't buy that this is going to discourage people, the threat of having their license taken away, which is, again, less severe than the threat of going to jail because you stole a car in the first place.
So you use the term ridiculous, which is a very good word. I use that all the time, too, to describe everything Trudeau. And, I'm not a partisan. I've been on your show where I've complimented certain things that he's done. To me, I'm issue by issue by issue. Ridiculous sort of minimizes what this is. It's actually insidious. And there is a difference between ridiculous and insidious because the Trudeau government knows exactly who's doing this. It's not being done by the Mennonite and the Amish. They welcome the people by the tens of thousands who come here only to run and ruin havoc on our streets. This is what we're going to talk about today with the licensing, the driving, the thefts, the carjacking, the home invasions. And, I take a bit of a different view, Andrew, than you did in your intro, which, you're right. Look, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. People will hear me talk here and go, well, wait a minute, how does this man defend these people? That's my day job. But that also means I understand how the sausage is made. So if we want to get to the truth, let's get to the truth. So you're absolutely right, Andrew, that it's not going to likely deter the kind of criminal mind, the kind of teenager, the kind of new Canadian, the kind of criminalized Canadian who is not at all concerned with what the rule changes are or even being licensed. But that to me, Andrew, while you're right, I still think there's an important thing the Ford government did today. And if you watch the Minister of Transportation, Sakaria, who had a very, very compelling 7 or 8 minute press conference today, and I watched it. And then he had the volunteer from Mothers Against Drunk Driving who lost her father and then her son in separate drunk driving crashes. To me, and I'll pause after this, whether or not it deters a criminal, a thug from doing what they do, the fact that you have the Ford government essentially coming out and saying, whether it makes a difference or not, we're still going to do what we think is right. We treat having a driver's license as a privilege, not a right. So whether it makes a difference or not, I think the changes they've brought forward, whether they're symbolic, whether they make a dent, I don't think they hurt, and I think they're likely to help. And there's a really powerful symbolism to me to the Ford government speaking to taxpayers and saying, we actually prioritize you over the criminals you're paying for.
That's actually quite a cogent defense of this. And if I then sort of realize that you've persuaded me slightly on this, I would also point out that it's something that comes relatively no cost. I mean, symbolic policy that comes at a cost is dangerous for other reasons. But, the amount, this really is the kind of thing that you can do. I mean, government can find ways to blow money on things that you shouldn't think would require, but doing something like this really doesn't cost anything.
Not only does it not cost anything, it actually saves on the back end, because whether you and I are right or wrong, that it's not going to deter a thug, Andrew. It's not. But if you look at impaired, which is a great line of work for criminal defense lawyers like me. So if something is great for me, it's bad for everybody else. So while
that's the same for me as a talk show host, by the way. The worse things are for the country, the better they are for the show.
I have to think about that. But if it's good for me or if it's good for an immigration lawyer, it's bad for everybody else. Now, what's the point I make about that? It won't deter a thug who's going to drive unlicensed, uninsured, who goes the wrong way on the 401 when he's out on bail for 13 things. But if you actually look at who commits a lot of impaireds, and there's this myth out there, Andrew, that they just got caught that one time they did it. It was that one time that they had those 2 extra drinks. No. If you're getting caught, it probably means you didn't get caught the other 20 times. So why does that link to my point here about the costs? A lot of people will hear about this, and if they're going to a Leaf game, they're going to a Raptor game to watch both of those teams lose, if they're going to a wedding or a bar mitzvah, just something in the back of their mind, and I can't prove this, Andrew, might make them say, look, nothing has worked before to deter them. Now my license could be taken away for a year or 2 or 5 or life, maybe 1 or 2. Now, again, Andrew, I'm making this point very distinctly. Maybe 1 or 2 people a week or a month might say, I'll take an Uber or I won't drive. But that 1 or 2 people could be another Marco Muzzo. And so for this to simply add suspension length, to add driving prohibition length, to add some administrative penalties, to add some interlock, does not cost the taxpayer. And the greatest denouement I can make to this sentence is look at what your first segment talked about $230 a day to people who have no business being here and a lot of the time are grifting us. This is a $0 investment by the Ford government, and I think is a bit of a shot across the bow, Andrew, to the Trudeau government to say, you be soft on crime, we'll be harder on crime. Not that the Ontario government can make criminal legislation. That's a constitutional issue, different story. But I think that's a very good place for the Ford government to be when there's an exodus out of Toronto. There's a real frustration about the increase of crime, lack of social cohesion. You name it, people are not happy with the state of our big cities across this country. Let Trudeau be the guy to own that. Let Ford be the guy to say, I'm fed up and I can't take it anymore.
Well, you touch on a very important part of this here, which is that criminal law is the domain of the federal government. And there have been a number of areas of law where the federal government has bungled it so much, it's really pushed provinces to get very creative and say,
that's being gentle.
What can we do in this realm? I mean, in the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they've done an end run around the federal government on a lot of firearms policy. In the case of just general criminal law for car theft, here you have Ontario saying, okay, we can't, get tough on this through criminal power, but this is the thing we can do.
they make because a lot, look, you get a number of criminal lawyers on, they're all going to, I think they're all going to, oh, there's a constitutional problem. It'll be challenged. Maybe it'll be overridden. Maybe one judge who really has never had anybody killed by a drunk driver will say it's the separation of, okay, wonderful, great. I don't care. There is a legitimate HTA purpose here, Highway Traffic Act. They can make, so long as they hire good lawyers to make their case, that there is a nexus, there is a connection here. It is not criminal. They're taking a suspension that would be 3 days and turning it to 7. It's already on the books. They're taking highway licensing, driver's licensing, which is an Ontario or provincial thing. Other provinces have done that. If they were to say, look, on your third one, we're giving you an extra 30 days jail, that's not what they're doing. So when I see in the last 2-3 days a lot of comments that, maybe this won't stand up and it's going to be challenged, who cares? That's a Ford government problem that they would welcome. It's like Pierre Poilievre, as you well know, Andrew, came out last week and said our bail system is broken. By the way, full disclosure, it is. And his position was, given a Supreme Court decision on parole and Paul Bernardo's and Veltman's, he'll use the notwithstanding clause if he has to. Do you think he cares that a bunch of commentators on the equivalent of MSNBC come out and say, oh, he can't do that, it's not constitutional? That's a battle that he can easily win, and that's a battle in the courtroom of the public opinion that I think is a very, very wise battle to be fought.
Well, yeah, I mean, and anytime you get like the CBC panel assembled to talk about, the constitutional precedent and all of that, you have, suburban moms in London, Ontario, in Kelowna, BC, that are looking at yet another press release from the local police department of a high-risk offender that's been released into the community. And I don't think they give a hoot about the charter.
The crazy part of it, Andrew, if you really want to stretch this to how crazy this is, look at the family that was killed on the 401, where that monster Singh, who was out on bail, on 2 or 3 bails, and again, nobody wants to have this conversation. He did not kill Caucasian John Smith, which usually makes it disappear in the paper because the victim is not chosen. He killed Indian people. He killed a baby. He killed Indian grandparents. And nobody wants to point out the fact that, are we allowed now to talk about the system being broken? Is it okay now? The point that I'm making is there's so much wokeness, there's so much identity politics brought into this. I invite people to go back and watch the minister who today spoke for 5 to 7 minutes. Very powerful. His name is Minister Sakaria. I don't know who he is. I've never seen him before. I wouldn't have picked him out of a police lineup until I saw this. The words that he said about why they're doing this, about people driving, law-abiding, innocent, rule-abiding, drive lawfully people with their families, with kids in car seats, that this government will do everything they can to try and make the roadways more safe. And then, as I said, brought in the volunteer from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who has lost her father and her son to this. Why shouldn't a government, with all the powers that they have, lawfully, constitutionally, do everything they can to send a message to the public that there is going to be a price for a decision being made? Andrew, here's the kicker of why impaired is such an it's taken for granted. It's taken lightly. Impaired driving are usually caused by people who should know better. It's not a homeless person stealing a sandwich from Loblaws. It is a person usually with a job, usually who knows better, but has been so cavalier with their approach to how they treat society and driving. And then they end up, Andrew, only with a $1,200 fine. Explain to me why potentially killing people, Marco Muzzo just got unlucky. He went through the wrong stop sign. Explain to me why this kind of behavior in this environment where every morning we wake up to road rage and crashes and drunk driving and new stats from the OPP. Explain to me why that's only worth $1,200, but stealing a sandwich or a homeless person or a drug addict who's not doing something violent, they go to jail for 2-3 months. That's a calculation that will never make sense to me.
Well, it's I'm glad you spit fire on this, Ari. We definitely need it, and your industry needs it, and politics needs it. So maybe you could be coaxed into becoming Attorney General or something in a couple of years' time. But
from your mouth to somebody's ears.
Fair enough. Good to talk to you, Ari. Ari Goldkind. Thanks for coming on.
Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.